Hello. Uh, this video I'm making today is a response to every time anyone says I miss how Ireland used to be and I don't like how Ireland has become with open borders. The first thing, the first thing invoked by an Irish progressive or lefty is, oh, so you want to go back to the 1980s where the bishop ruled with an iron fist and everybody was unemployed and in poverty and there was no diversity of food, which is hilarious because, well, it's not hilarious, it's sickening because, like, to an Irish progressive or lefty, an Irish person, child, having a knife driven through their skull outside of school by an Algerian doctor or engineer is more than a small price. It's just a small price to pay for great ethnic restaurants. They literally think and that's not an exaggeration. They literally think it's okay for foreign criminals to come into this country undocumented, live on unemployment, and kill and attempt to murder Irish children because it's a small price to pay for great ethnic restaurants. This is literally how these fuckers think. Now, so I want to address this invocation by the progressives of how horrible life was in the 80s and how we could never go back. To listen to an Irish lefty or progressive talk about the 80s, you would think the famine, the penal laws, uh, Cromwell's genocide, and all that happened in the 1980s. It didn't take place in hundreds of centuries back. It took place in. This is how they talk about the 1980s. So, as someone who's familiar with the 1980s, I left secondary school, what you Americans call high school, in 1982, and I left Ireland. Well, I left Ireland. I didn't leave Ireland to go to America because I must leave to forsake this awful place. It was really because I wanted to do New York. I had this obsession with, like, America, and I wanted to be a part of it. So it was, but I actually loved Ireland, and I travelled extensively through it. So I can speak first-hand experience of 4 years of the 1980s, and the rest I was coming back and forth. So I can speak about that as well. And I had friends and stuff who still lived here. So let's address the first thing they bring up: religious oppression. Okay, yes, it was difficult for unmarried people to get contraception, but married people could get contraceptive. To get the pill and everything. They could. Women could get a doctor's prescription, and so that was nonsense. But it was totally easy to get condoms and stuff in Dublin when I was growing up. They were not difficult to get. They were everywhere. People brought them back from England or brought them back from their holidays, and they would give them to you, or you had no problem getting them. Women would often bring them back from their overseas holidays. Uh, so that was, yeah, it was bullshit, but it wasn't like this thing where, I must restrain my lad for fear that the bishops might see me putting a piece of rubber on it. There was that nothing like that existed. Now, abortion. Well, they're obsessed with abortion. Is to say, next to their fetish for young Arab boys, their second fetish is abortion, killing babies, unborn babies. Yeah, abortion was illegal in Ireland. Well, actually, it wasn't. If you look at the law, it was kind of very vague. It could be terminated, to save the life of the mother. So, when abortion was legalized in Ireland, it was really to clarify the law, but it wasn't illegal as such. And also, if you wanted to get an abortion, Liverpool was over there, Manchester was over there, a quick hop over. It wasn't, that hard. So, it wasn't, the feminists tried to make, she's on the boat to her horse, or, it was like this bullshit, and I'm not aware of any backstreet abortions ever being, practiced in Ireland. You could travel to Britain or anywhere very easily and do that if you wanted that. And and as for sexual repression, I had loads of girls, you know. I mean, and they weren't just like Dublin girls or Ballymun girls. They were. I mean, I had a girlfriend from from I think Nina or some Ross Gray in Tipperary, and she lived in a flat above in Rathmines above the Rathmines Cricket Club, and this is a family channel. I won't go into details, but she would have made an excellent fast bowler, to use a cricketing analogy. But you know, that was that all went on. There was there was no, I mean, I remember my memory of Irish women in the 1980s, in late teens, early 20s, as them being very sexually feral and very sexually, not promiscuous, but like they were, they were doing the rounds. There's none of this thing like, oh, chattering of teeth. Yeah, so it's like it was the whole thing that everyone was like, wearing a chastity belt in case the priest found out they had an erection, as the lefties will tell you. It was just bullshit. And the clerical, everyone knew the church were pedos, and when a bishop made a statement about, anything like to do with that, to do with sex or family planning or anything, uh, anyone, 90% of the country under the age of 40 at the time would just laugh at the bishop or laugh at the priests. Only a few, like only a certain type, took it seriously. Religious, very religious types. So that you can have, and yeah, a lot of people went to mass in church then. I didn't, because um, that's me from the time I was a kid. But a lot of it had to do with sheeple OCD kind of thing. I'd actually be the first to say that Catholicism is probably stronger in Ireland now than it was in the 1980s, because the people who go to mass now genuinely go as an expression, for the most part, because of their faith. They want to be there. In the 1980s, it was like sheeple thing. It was like you just went. There was a lot of that kind of thing went on, and also a lot of schools were run by Catholic churches. It was to get into the really best schools. It was a good idea to, like, brown nose the local Vatican representative to get your kids into the best school. So a lot of that kind of thing went on as well. A lot of people would have been in church town, would have been just like doing it out of just, they were brainwashed into it by their parents, but they weren't really into it. So it wasn't like that. There wasn't that many morning rosary beads and stuff like that. So I'd say, like, Catholicism is actually in a better place now in Ireland than it was then. There's a lot less people going to church, but they're the real devotees. Good luck to them. That's a much healthier situation than people just go because they're afraid the neighbours are going to talk about them, that their kids aren't baptized or something. So, so that was all blown out of proportion. Most people just laughed at the clergy when they opened this, and especially when they were all found out to be banging their housekeepers, and all that kind of thing. People they went, oh, we all knew that. Sure, they're all hypocrites. People laughed at it. Sure, when Bishop Eamon Casey, here's how oppressed we were. When Bishop Eamon Casey was found out, the Bishop of Galway was found out that he had an illegitimate son by an American woman, there was a song in the Irish charts called Debunking Bishop. That's how oppressed we were by the church, okay? So get that one right, get that one right. I am the bunking bishop, I'm bunking all the day, I'm bunking in Galway town and bunking in the USA. Something like that it went. It was very funny. But that's that. So, there wasn't the clergy knocking on the door saying, don't play that record. And it was the Father Ted mentality towards that kind of clergy existed. Now, we had a local Catholic priest that was actually a cool guy. And he was the one who gave me a lot of tips about, like, going to America, because he'd worked in some kind of, hostel or something in Philadelphia. And he said, like, the poverty they have in Philadelphia is far more worse than anything you'll see in Ireland. And that's another thing. Poverty. Unemployment. That's the one they always bring up. Yes, there was huge numbers of unemployed people. But guess what? They were all working too. There was a massive black market, of people doing nixers, as they called them, or working jobs off the books while they were collecting unemployment. There was no, every single person. I'd never ever took the dole when I was a kid in Ireland. I never took the dole. I did well. I didn't need it because I had a job right at school. I was looking at, I was a hustler. I was able to get work, like doing menial job, working in restaurants and bars and all kinds of things, and I was happy to do it. And but I never needed the dole. But people who had the dole could, they were all working. They weren't sitting at home. It wasn't like you weren't sitting at home going, "Oh God, slash me wrists," They were, yeah, you get those types. They'll be miserable even if they're happy. They're probably the ones who are the progressives today. But everyone else was working on building sites, doing nixers, all kinds of work. I mean, all kinds of work, like things you couldn't even you'd be surprised by. Truck driving, everything, all on the sly. So there was a huge sort of like economy of people of dole spongers, and good luck to them. They weren't. I mean, why shouldn't they? That's the way I see it. Yeah, it's not fair to people. But the reason why they were on the dole is because the people who had companies and jobs knew that the main reason there was unemployment in Ireland in the 80s was tons of work. There was factories everywhere. A lot of people refused to work legally because the taxation was terrible. There was awful high taxation in Ireland in the 1980s, and that was a huge part of the problem. Now that would be lefties. Lefties love taxation, so that would have been one of their policies, and they love high taxation. So that's why a lot of people didn't work, and they worked in the black market or in the hidden black economy because it wasn't worth it. Overtime was pointless. If you worked overtime, you'd get pennies for it, And even like the middle class and everyone were all finding ways to skive cash and hide money and stuff. It was like Italy, and it was actually it was fine. That's what you did. You did to survive that. You did that to get by. And so a lot of that went on. And so everybody had a home. Here's how easy it was to get a council house or flat. I had friends who didn't want to leave Ballymun when their parents left, and they would walk up to the Dublin Corporation at the time, housing office in Ballymun, and they would say to the people behind the counter, "I'm 19, 18. My parents threw me out of the house because I was causing trouble. I'm homeless." And right there and then, not on a waiting list, right there and then, the Dublin Corporation people would hand you the keys to a flat in Ballymun. There were no homeless people. There were so few homeless people that they chose it, or they were people with alcohol. In fact, there were so few in the city of Dublin. There were so few homeless people that people knew them by name. Knew them by name. There were so few of them. It was like everyone knew because they were the only ones you ever saw. Now, beggars on the streets, they were professional beggars. They were travellers. Yeah, the lefties are all going, hey, traveller phobia. No, they were all left. You know that famous cover of The Economist was Ireland, the riches of the poor, and they showed that was a traveller, professional beggar on the cover of the magazine. They were professional beggars, okay, just like the Roma are today. Oh, racist. No, it's true, okay. And so the average, no Irish person was on the street begging. They didn't exist, okay. I will talk about what things that were genuinely not good, but I'm talking about this is the hell that we lived in, right? So everybody, like, you had a family, could have a family where the father was unemployed, right? The mother was taking care of the three kids. They all had healthcare. The kids were all put through school, right through college, all the way through college, if they needed it and wanted, or trade school. And they lived in a very nice three or four bedroom house or 2 bedroom house supplied by the council for a small rent. Now you're paying enormous rents or mortgages, and the Irish government are in direct combat with you in the housing market to buy the houses around you, making it difficult for you to buy a house, getting anyone to get into, or even to rent a place, and handing them over to the doctors and engineers. And this is a fact. This is just a fact. Okay. Culturally, well, I can tell you for a fact, the 1980s in Ireland were culturally fucking magnificent. In the course of, I have a book somewhere that I wrote down all the bands I'd seen from 1980 to 1984 in Ireland. It was everybody. It's just incredible. I saw everybody. I saw bands that people would dream about seeing in smaller venues. The biggest one would be like a 2,000 seater, 3,000 seater. But in average places like big clubs, I saw them all. In the Fisborough Plaza, in the course of 1 month in the summer, I saw Susie and the Banshees, the Ramones, and the Skids alone. Right? I saw Motorhead in Navan in County Meath. Bands toured the country. I have a friend who grew up in Waterford, a small city in the southwest. He saw everybody too. They saw the Smiths. I saw the Smiths. I saw Big Country. I saw Simple Minds. And you literally 2 or 3 bands a week, and that wouldn't only be British bands. They'd be like, you could see Metallica or Nirvana. Well, that'll be later, but definitely Metallica. I saw AC/DC with Bon Scott. I think that was 1979 or 1980. But the same period, the same horror show that they tell you about, at the Olympic Ballroom on Camden Street. Okay, I was 16 or 15. I saw Simple Minds. I saw U2 loads of times. I saw Roxy Music. I saw every band that I was into literally had played in Dublin or toured Ireland. There was no band. The only one that didn't come was Rush. That I remember that they didn't come for some reason, but everyone else really did, and it was amazing. And you could see these bands for like £2.50 or £2. I think the tickets. I think the ticket to see Susie and Banshee in the Fisborough Plaza, Fisborough, it was like £199 or something stupid like that. I saw, name them. I saw them. The Smith, everybody. I saw UFO at the National Stadium. I saw, everybody. I remember seeing Anvil. Remember them, the metal band? I saw Judas Priest. I saw Sabbath with Ian Gillan. I saw, everybody. I saw them all. So the music scene, and then we had our own internal music scene of Irish bands, and it was incredible. There were venues everywhere, and if you started a band, you'd be guaranteed a paid gig as soon as you had a set. And people went out. People went out all the time. There was it's so-called. It was so cheap to go out. It was so cheap, and not just pubs, even to go out eating. And there's the other one, ethnic food. Let's talk about that one. Well, I grew up with Chinese, Indian. There was lots of Vietnamese places because of the boat people. There was a pizza. Everyone ate pizza. The things that were hard to get were in the specific ingredients. So it would be hard to get olive oil. You could get it, but you'd have to go looking for it. Or things like that, or artichokes in olive oil, or the kind of foods you get in like the shops now. That would have been hard. But we had Italian next door neighbours in Jobstown in Tala, and they cooked Italian food all the time, so they were getting it from somewhere in Dublin. They used to invite us over for dinner. So, and that's another thing. Everyone was Irish, white, and Catholic or Protestant. Well, no. In Ballymun, there were 2 black families I knew: the Ginadus and the Anticolas. Right? They were 2 black families I knew. I told you we had Italian neighbours next door. I worked with a Jewish guy called Victor Coslin, who was a massive Shamrock Rovers fan. He was a barber, and he a lovely bloke, and he was like the first Jewish person I ever knew personally. He was, and he had the broadest Dublin accent you ever heard. Like that, he spoke like, Thomas, let me tell you about the 1964 FAI Cup final between Waterford United and Shamrock Rovers. He spoke like that. I remember seeing Shelbourne when they played in Ringsend. This kind of. He was a great and a lovely man, a beautiful guy, and so there was English. There was lots of English people living in Ireland at the time. There were lots of Americans lived in Ireland when I remember. You'd meet Americans that lived in Ireland everywhere, and lots of English and Scottish. Well, Scottish lived in Dublin. I remember those years, and lots of Scousers. Dublin was full of Scousers, Liverpoolians, and and there was lots of movement back and forth. Everybody had the money to travel. Okay, airfares were very expensive until Ryanair came along, but there were ferries. I remember there's a company called Magic Bus. I think it was a British company. You could go down to a place near Grafton Street. It was a basement record shop, and buy Magic Bus tickets there. You could go to Paris return on Magic Bus for £20. And I was, to Paris, and people did it all the time. You could go to Marrakesh on Magic Bus, or Istanbul. They went everywhere except Eastern Europe because of the Cold War was still going on, and a lot of people used to holiday. Irish people would holiday in Yugoslavia when in the early 1980s. This so that this whole thing, it was hell, like the way the Irish progressives go on, that it was hell on earth, is just not true. It's just not true. Now, there was bad things. I'll give you some of the bad things. The the weather was also brilliant, I remember, during the early 80s. Bad things. There was a big heroin problem in Dublin in particular, in the north side of Dublin, Ballymun. Yes, that was real. There was a heroin problem. And these things happen. There was a heroin problem. This is the modern world we live in, where no one sat down and forced it, but there was. I knew a lot of I had friends who died of heroin. It was a lot like the movie Trainspotting. Imagine that with Dublin accents instead of Edinburgh accents. That's what it was like. There was a lot of that kind of lifestyle. But that's the modern world we live in. That goes on everywhere. There was. I'm trying to think of real television was awful. Even the British television was awful in the 80s. The music was amazing. The films were great. That in the cinema, you go to cinema real cheap. Cinemas everywhere, and even small towns had them. And and it wasn't just people in large cities like Dublin. You had small towns. You'd find these things I'm talking about in them as well. So it wasn't this kind of and there was still loads of Irish stuff as well. There was Irish music, even though you might have gone to see the Skids or Sham 69 or someone like that play. Or I remember there was before it burned down the ballroom in Raheny, if it was whatever it's called. I can remember the last bands that played there were the Specials, Madness, the Selector. The ska thing was really big. The Stardust Ballroom, and that was right next to Ballymun. I mean, this is the kind of the cultural opportunities are off the scale. You could see Marina Abramovich performing at the Arts Centre in Dublin, for free. You could see her for free. She performed her Rest Energy working, the one where she held the bow and Ule holds where she'd be killed very easily. That was first performed in Dublin in 1988, I think. There was a lot less of what we had, but nobody was really. We weren't aware that we were suffering. You couldn't get organic, pickled aubergines with the fair trade label on them in Tesco's, or or whatever the supermarket was at the time. No, you couldn't get that, but you didn't feel like you were being damaged as a human being because of it. This is how these lefties think. They literally think that was people were damaged by that stuff, not having access to that stuff. The trappings of their their affluence and decadence. Yeah, I mean, that's just basically it. I remember I came back to Ireland because I didn't have horrible memories of it after living in America for many years. I came back to Ireland because I always loved Ireland, and that love of Ireland was forged. Oh, another thing, travel. You could travel very cheaply as a young person. I had the student cards as well as the hostel cards, and I got to see all the places in England and I travelled the first time to Europe and stuff on hostel cards very cheaply. So that's another thing. We weren't locked at home, in terror, waiting for the priest to knock on the door to search your house for condoms. Gay people, I knew loads of them. Gay lifestyle, completely. I remember 1980s gay parades in Dublin. I can remember, the gay pubs like Bartley Dunn's and other places were well known to be frequented by gay people, and the police never bothered them. Even though homosexuality was against the law and divorce was illegal, that's a different thing than being arrested because you did it. No one would be unless they were caught with a young kid or doing something obscene. I can't remember anyone being arrested for being gay, unless they wanted as some kind of activist thing, or I can't ever remember or ever being charged or brought to court for it. They think that because divorce. The bad thing was divorce. That was a bad one. Now that doesn't mean they lived together because the law made them. No, they broke up. They broke up and they moved. They lived separate lives. The Irish divorce was generally the man moved away and the woman look after the kids, and he would send her a few quid. But there was no real legal protection there. But there's someone's argued the men have no legal protection under the divorce laws now. If men are basically third class citizens in Irish family courts now, since everything was legalized. It's a lot better for the women, but it's a hell of a lot worse for the men. And so I'm trying to think of anything else that was hell. You know, I'm trying to think of something like I'm waking up in the morning and say I hate this fucking country. The troubles in Northern Ireland, that really upset me. But that was Northern Ireland. That didn't really affect me. But I hate the idea that Irish people of two different religions and traditions were killing each other, 100 miles up the road. That really used to bother me. It used to really bother me. And that things like IRA bombs going off in England, and that really used to upset me, and it used to upset most Irish people. That was the dark stuff. That was the dark stuff of the 80s, and yet that didn't affect most people unless you lived in like Belfast or Derry, or your family were in the security services up there. But it used to break my heart that that Irish people of two different religions were up there. Well, down south the Catholics and Protestants got. That's another thing. Down south Protestants and Catholics got on fine. You wouldn't even be aware of someone's religion. I used to know people, and it was only years later I found that they were Protestant. No one cared, unless you were some asshole and you made it your business to care, and that kind of thing. So, no, it wasn't a hell on earth. It was actually quite amazing to be there. There was a phenomenal cottage industry of things like fanzines. I was involved in that myself. Local gigs, local arts events, people putting their own artsy thing together. The Project Arts Centre. There was all that, and look at all the filmmakers, Jim Sheridan, so many great movie directors and actors, Gabriel Byrne, loads of them. They all came out of that Irish sort of like do-it-yourself art set, like literally finding an abandoned building and putting on an art exhibit or a play. And next thing you know, it produces people who are in Hollywood movies. It was amazing. Like there was a lot of that went on. And there was loads of places to go out, loads of nightclubs, loads of places to go dancing. There was late night venues. I mean, there was one point where me and my friend Jerry practically lived in nightclubs on Leeson Street. And we only got in because we knew a lot of clientele from where we worked. But yeah, and then you could get a taxi home. You could afford things. Things were affordable. Everything was much cheaper. The low wages were lower, but it just seemed it was more. You hear people today saying, "Well, you can get much more groceries for your money in Ireland now than you can then." Sure, that's definitely true. Food and stuff is cheaper, but it means nothing when they look at the price of rent, and the price of mortgages, the cost of houses. That erase all that. The cost of living is not just the groceries that the economists measure your lifestyle by. It's things like your accommodation and transport costs and things like that. And there was total freedom of speech. You could say whatever you wanted. There was no crackdowns on it. I don't remember anyone being particularly racist. For the sake of it, I don't remember that, or homophobic or anything like that. And yeah, so lefties, when you invoke the 80s, you're invoking something that wasn't so. I mean, I wouldn't want to go back to it in its entirety, but I would like to. I did like I'll never come back, but the sort of cultural opportunities for kids with no money like me were immense, immense. Everyone seemed to be involved in the arts. If not, put plays or bands or art, visual arts, fanzines, loads were involved in things like Irish music, things like that, as well. Irish music thrived in that time. There were Céilís constantly, and there was like sessions everywhere, and everyone seemed to be able to play an instrument back then and join in. So the 80s were nothing like the hellhole that the progressives make it like today. Is it better today? In terms of like opportunities and accessibility of things, yeah, absolutely it's better today. Is the quality of life better today? I don't know. What's it? 40% of Irish people on SSRIs? You tell me. And the irony of all, when the ones who claimed that the 80s lacked freedom in Ireland, the progressive left in Ireland, the only time in Ireland that I ever felt I was a prisoner of the state was the scamdemic lockdown from 2020 to 2021. And who was behind and endorsed all that? The same progressive left. Oh, irony of feckin' ironies. Take care, sanguine gnosis.